She did not speak at the wedding breakfast, and it took him until the second course to notice. Sebastian Aldworth, 7th Duke of Thornfield, had married Miss Beatrice Langley at 10:30 that morning in the chapel of St. George's, Hanover Square, before 140 guests who had come not because they cared for the bride, but because refusing a duke's invitation carried consequences that no sensible family wished to court. The ceremony had been brief, correct, and entirely without incident. She had said her vows clearly. He had said his. The ring had been placed. The register had been signed in her small, precise hand, and they had walked out together into the April morning and climbed into his carriage and been driven to Aldworth House, where the breakfast had been laid in the long dining room and where his mother's portrait still hung above the mantelpiece, because no one had ever dared suggest removing it. He had seated her at his right hand, as was proper. He had poured her wine, which she had not touched. He had introduced her to Lord Pemberton and Lady Chiswick and the Bishop of Salisbury, each of whom had offered congratulations in the particular tone that society reserved for marriages everyone understood to be practical arrangements rather than love matches. She had received each of them with a small inclination of her head and a silence so absolute that it could have been mistaken for deafness, except that her eyes, dark, steady, missing nothing, moved with the conversation like someone following a piece of music she had chosen not to join. It was not until Sir Arthur Foley, seated at his left, leaned across and said, "Your bride is remarkably composed, Thornfield," that Sebastian looked at her properly for the first time since the church. She was sitting very still. Her hands were in her lap, folded the way women fold their hands when they have been taught that stillness is a form of invisibility. Her plate had been served, cold ham, eggs, a wedge of game pie, and she had not touched it. Her wineglass stood full beside her plate. She was looking at a point somewhere in the middle distance, beyond the flowers, beyond the silver epergine his grandmother had commissioned from a silversmith in Bond Street, beyond the room itself. She was present, and she was absent. She was there, and she was not there. She was his wife, and she was a stranger, and he realized, with a sharpness that caught him off guard, that he did not know a single thing about her that mattered. He knew the things that had made the marriage sensible. Her father, Sir Reginald Langley, held land in Wiltshire that bordered the Thornfield estate's southern edge, 3,000 acres of good farmland with a river running through it that Sebastian needed for the drainage scheme Mercer had been proposing for 2 years. Sir Reginald had 3 daughters and no sons, mounting debts, and a profound desire to see at least one of his girls settled before the creditors arrived. Beatrice was the eldest. She was 23. She was, by the standards of the ton, unremarkable. Not plain, not pretty, not brilliant, not dull. She was the kind of woman who moved through a room without disturbing the air, and Sebastian had chosen her precisely because of this, because he wanted a wife who would manage the household competently and make no demands and leave him to his work in the House of Lords and his land and his life, which was already arranged exactly as he wanted it. His life included Lady Diana Wentworth. Diana was 30, sharp-featured, clever, a widow of 4 years whose husband had left her a house in Curzon Street and a reputation that she managed with the precision of a general directing a campaign. She and Sebastian had been lovers for 18 months. She was not discreet about it. Discretion, she had told him once, was a form of shame, and she did not consider their arrangement shameful, but neither was she flagrant. London knew in the way London always knew, and the knowing was part of the architecture of their world. The Duke had a mistress, as dukes did, and the Duke was marrying for land and duty, as dukes did, and the mistress would remain, as mistresses did, and the wife would endure, as wives did. Sebastian had not considered whether Beatrice knew. He had not considered Beatrice at all, beyond the negotiations with her father and the settlements drawn by his solicitor, and the morning in Sir Reginald's drawing-room when he had offered for her, and she had sat in the window seat with her hands folded in precisely the way they were folded now, and said simply, "If my father wishes it, I have no objection." He had taken that for compliance. He was beginning to suspect it was something else. The breakfast lasted 90 minutes. Sebastian spoke with Pemberton about the drainage scheme, and with the bishop about a living in Wiltshire that had come vacant, and with Lady Chiswick about a charity concert she was organizing for the Foundling Hospital. He fulfilled his duties as host with the ease of a man who had been hosting dinners since he was 24 and found the mechanics of social performance no more taxing than breathing. Every 10 minutes, without intending to, he glanced to his right. She had not moved. She had not spoken. She had not eaten. The ham grew cold. The wine grew warm. The flowers, white roses which Mrs. Thorne the housekeeper had selected because they were inoffensive and appropriate, drooped slightly in the heat of the room, and Beatrice sat among them like a woman made of the same material, beautiful in a way that nobody stopped to notice, and slowly wilting. By the time the guests began to leave, Sebastian had made his first observation. Her silence was not sullenness. It was not shyness. It was the particular cultivated quietness of a woman who had learned, through long practice, that her voice was not welcome. She did not speak because she had been taught. By whom? By Sir Reginald? By the world? That speaking would not change anything, and so she had stopped trying. He had married a woman who had stopped trying. The guests departed between noon and 1 o'clock. Lady Chiswick kissed Beatrice on both cheeks and whispered something that made Beatrice nod but not smile. Lord Pemberton clapped Sebastian on the shoulder and said, with the jovial insensitivity of a man who had married for love and assumed everyone else would eventually do the same, "Well, Thornfield, you've done it. Now begins the interesting part." The interesting part, as it turned out, began in the corridor outside the breakfast room. Sebastian found Beatrice standing at the foot of the main staircase, looking upward. She had her hand on the banister, a light touch, as though she were not sure she was permitted to hold it, and she was studying the portraits that lined the staircase wall. His grandfather, his grandmother, his uncle, his mother, in the blue silk gown she had worn to be presented at court, with the Thornfield sapphires at her throat and an expression that suggested she found the entire exercise faintly absurd. "That's my mother," Sebastian said. Beatrice looked at him. It was the first time since the ceremony that she had looked at him directly, and the effect was unsettling, not because her eyes were beautiful, though they were, dark brown and very clear, but because they contained a quality he had not anticipated. Intelligence. Not the performed intelligence of a woman displaying her accomplishments in a drawing room, but the quiet, private intelligence of someone who had been watching and thinking and drawing conclusions for 23 years with no one to share them with. "She looks as though she's about to say something witty," Beatrice said. It was the first thing she had said that was not an answer to a question. Sebastian stared at her. "She was," he said after a moment, "constantly. My father said it was both her greatest virtue and her most terrifying quality." The corner of Beatrice's mouth moved, not quite a smile, not quite the absence of one, but a flicker of something that had been so thoroughly suppressed that its brief appearance was startling, like a candle lit in a room everyone had assumed was empty. Then she looked away, and the flicker was gone, and she said, "Mrs. Thorne mentioned that my rooms are on the 2nd floor. If you will excuse me, I should like to rest." She walked up the stairs. She did not look back. Sebastian stood at the bottom and watched her go and felt, for the first time, that something was wrong, not with the marriage, which was exactly the practical arrangement he had designed it to be, but with himself for having designed it. He went to his study. He intended to work. There were letters from Mercer about the drainage scheme, and a memorandum from Lord Grey about the reform debate in the Lords, and a note from Diana asking when she might expect him. He read Mercer's letter. He read Grey's memorandum. He picked up Diana's note and read it twice and set it down and picked it up and set it down again. The note said, "I trust the morning went smoothly. When you are free, I am at home." The paper smelled of her perfume, jasmine, and something darker beneath it, and it was written in her confident, sweeping hand, and it assumed, with the easy certainty of a woman who had never been surprised by a man's behavior, that nothing had changed. Sebastian sat at his desk and thought about the woman upstairs who had not spoken at her own wedding breakfast. He thought about her hands in her lap. He thought about the untouched plate. He thought about the way she had looked at his mother's portrait and said the first unsolicited thing she had said all day, and it had been perceptive and quietly funny, and delivered with the caution of someone placing a valuable object on a table she suspected might collapse. He thought about Sir Reginald's drawing room and the window seat, and, "If my father wishes it, I have no objection." He had heard compliance. He heard it differently now. He heard a woman who had been so thoroughly convinced that her wishes were irrelevant that she had stopped expressing them. Not because she did not have them, but because having them hurt more than not having them, and she had chosen the option that hurt less. At 3 o'clock, he went to find Mrs. Thorne. The housekeeper was in the still room, supervising the arrangement of preserves with the military precision she brought to all household operations. She was 58, had served at Aldworth House since Sebastian's mother's time, and possessed the rare ability to convey disapproval without changing her expression. "Mrs. Thorne," Sebastian said, "what do you make of the Duchess?" Mrs. Thorne set down a jar of quince jelly with deliberate care. "Your Grace, your honest assessment. She arrived with one trunk?" Mrs. Thorne said. "One. I have seen ladies' maids bring more luggage for a weekend in the country. Her gowns are well made but old. She brought her own writing paper and her own ink, as though she did not expect them to be provided. She asked me where the library was, and when I showed her, she touched the books the way one touches something one has been missing." Sebastian said nothing. "She thanked me 3 times in the first hour," Mrs. Thorne continued. "Not in the manner of a woman accustomed to being served, in the manner of a woman accustomed to being tolerated, who is grateful not to be asked to leave." She paused, and Sebastian saw something cross the housekeeper's face that he had seen only once before, the morning after his mother died, when Mrs. Thorne had stood in the kitchen and told the staff that the household would continue as her Grace would have wished, and her voice had not wavered, but her hands gripping the edge of the table had been white at the knuckles. "If I may speak freely, Your Grace." "You always do, Mrs. Thorne." "She reminds me of your mother." She held up a hand before he could respond. "Not in manner, not in temperament. Your mother was forceful. She filled a room. This girl empties herself from a room. But they share a quality. They both see things. Your mother saw the crack in the plaster before the wall fell. She saw the tenant who was struggling before he asked for help. She saw you, Your Grace, before you became who she knew you would become." Mrs. Thorne picked up the quince jelly again, as though the conversation had become more personal than she intended. "The Duchess sees things. I watched her walk through the entrance hall this morning, and her eyes went to the place where the floorboard creaks, to the window that doesn't close properly, to the flowers that were already wilting because the girl who arranged them put them too close to the fire. She saw all of it. She said nothing, but she saw." The tightness in Sebastian's chest, which had begun at the breakfast table and which he had been ignoring with the discipline of a man who preferred not to examine his own feelings, became something he could no longer ignore. "What did she have for luncheon?" he asked. "She did not come down for luncheon. I sent a tray to her room. The maid reports that she ate the bread and drank the tea and left the rest." "She ate the bread and drank the tea." Sebastian returned to his study. He sat at his desk. The room was quiet, the particular quiet of a London house in the early afternoon, when the street noise dims and the servants move softly and the walls seem to hold their breath. Diana's note lay where he had left it, the jasmine perfume now faintly oppressive in the close air of the room. He read it one more time. "I trust the morning went smoothly. When you are free, I am at home." He sat with it for a long time, not because he was uncertain. The decision, he realized, had already been made, somewhere between the second course and the still room, somewhere between the untouched plate and Mrs. Thorne's description of a woman who touched books like someone reuniting with something she had been missing. He sat with it because he wanted to understand the man who had written to Diana that morning, the man who had sealed the note with the easy assumption that nothing would change, and how that man had become, in the space of 6 hours, someone who found the assumption unbearable. He thought about Beatrice's hands folded in her lap. He thought about the bread and tea. He thought about a woman who arrived at a duke's house with one trunk and her own writing paper, because she did not expect to be given any. And he thought about what kind of life teaches a person to expect so little. And he thought about the fact that he had chosen her precisely for the qualities that life had beaten into her: her quietness, her invisibility, her willingness to take up no space, and that choosing her for those things was not materially different from the world that had created them. He took a clean sheet of paper from the drawer. He dipped his pen. He wrote 6 lines, signed his name, sealed the letter, and rang for a footman. "Deliver this to Lady Wentworth's house in Curzon Street," he said. "Wait for no reply." The letter said, "I will not be calling again. I wish you well, and I thank you for your companionship these past months. What we have had is at its end. Please do not write to this house. Thornfield. It was 4:30 in the afternoon. He had been married for 6 hours. At 6 o'clock he knocked on the door of Beatrice's sitting room. There was a pause, long enough that he almost knocked again, and then her voice surprised. Come in. She was at the writing desk, not the one Mrs. Thorne had provided, which was new and properly appointed, but the small traveling desk she had brought with her, open on the table with her own paper and her own ink, exactly as Mrs. Thorne had described. She was writing a letter. She stood when he entered, as though she were a guest in her own home, and the gesture, the automatic deference of a woman who expected to be in the way, struck him with a force he was not prepared for. Please sit, he said. This is your room. She sat. She watched him with those dark, careful eyes. I noticed, he said, that you did not speak at breakfast. She said nothing, which was, he supposed, consistent. I noticed that you did not eat. I noticed that you did not drink the wine. I noticed that when Lady Chiswick spoke to you, you nodded but did not answer. I noticed that when we returned to the house, you looked at the portraits as though you were in a museum rather than your home. He paused. I would like to understand why. The silence lasted a long time, not an empty silence, a full one, thick with everything she was deciding whether to say. You did not marry me for conversation, she said at last. No, he said. I did not. You married me because my father's land adjoins yours and because I would not make demands, and because you wished your life to remain as it was, with a wife installed to manage the house and produce an heir and otherwise occupy as little of your attention as possible. She said this without bitterness. She said it the way one states the terms of a contract, clearly, precisely, without embellishment. I did not speak at breakfast because you did not require me to speak. I am here to fulfill a purpose. I intend to fulfill it quietly. Every word she said was accurate. Every word she said described the marriage he had designed, and every word felt, hearing it spoken in her calm, clear voice, like a door being closed on something he had not known was open. You are correct, he said. That is what I intended. Then I'm behaving exactly as intended. You are. He looked at her, at the traveling desk, at the ink that was her own, at the bread crusts on the tray by the window, at the single trunk that Mrs. Thorne had mentioned, the sum total of everything Beatrice Langley had brought to a marriage that gave her a title and a house and a life she had not asked for. But I find that what I intended was wrong. She went very still. I wrote to Lady Wentworth this afternoon, he said. I have ended the arrangement. She will not be a presence in this house or in this marriage. Beatrice's expression did not change, but her hands, which had been folded in her lap with that practiced invisible stillness, tightened, a small contraction of the fingers, barely visible, the kind of movement a woman makes when she is holding herself together against something she did not expect to feel. You did not need to do that, she said. I know. I would not have asked. I know that too. That is precisely why I did it. He sat forward. I have spent the past 6 hours paying attention to you for the first time, and I do not like what I have seen. Not you. What I have seen of you is... He stopped. He was not a man who struggled with words, but these words were unfamiliar, like a language he had once known and forgotten. What I have seen is a woman who has been taught that she takes up too much space simply by existing, and I contributed to that. I chose you because you would be invisible, and you have spent this entire day proving me right, and I am asking you to stop. The room was very quiet. The late afternoon light came through the window and fell across the traveling desk, and the letter she had been writing, and her hands, which were no longer folded but open, palms upward in her lap, as though she had set down something she had been carrying for a very long time. I do not know how to stop, she said. I've been this way for a very long time. Then we will learn together, he said, because I suspect I have been my way for a very long time as well, and today has made me think that my way is not the right one either. She looked at him. The dark eyes, watchful, intelligent, exhaustively careful, searched his face for the thing she always searched for, the evidence that this was temporary, that the attention would withdraw, that she would be asked to fold her hands and disappear again. She did not find it. "Would you like to have dinner with me?" he said. "Not a formal dinner, not a performance, just dinner, in the small dining room. And you could tell me what you were writing if you wished. Or we could sit in silence, but it would be a different kind of silence." The architecture of something, not quite a smile, not yet, but the first indication that a smile was structurally possible, appeared at the corner of her mouth. "I was writing to my sisters," she said, "telling them that the house is very large and the housekeeper is very kind and the Duke is—" She paused. I had not yet decided what to say about the Duke. "What will you say now?" She considered this. "That he is more observant than I expected." They dined together in the small dining room at 7:30. Mrs. Thorne, who had been given less than an hour's notice to prepare a second setting, had managed it with the seamless competence of a woman who believed that domestic crises were simply household decisions made under time pressure. The room was paneled in dark oak and lit by candles in the wall sconces, and the table, which seated only 6, felt intimate in a way that the long dining room, with its 40 chairs and its silver épergné and its portrait of Sebastian's mother, never could. Beatrice sat across from him. She looked at the setting, the good china, the fresh flowers, a smaller arrangement than the morning's but more carefully chosen, tulips from the hothouse in pale yellow, and something in her expression shifted. Not dramatically. A softening of the line between her brows, the unclenching of a jaw that had been held tight since morning. "Mrs. Thorne chose tulips," she said. "She has views about flowers. She has views about everything. She told me this morning that the linen cupboard has not been properly organized since your mother's time, and that she's been waiting for someone with authority and sense to address it." Beatrice paused. I believe she was making a request. She was. She has been making that request for 9 years. I have been pretending not to understand it. The corner of Beatrice's mouth moved again, that flicker, that preliminary architecture. "I will speak to her about the linen cupboard tomorrow. I suspect she is counting on it." She spoke. Not much, not yet, but enough. She told him about her sisters, Arabella and Catherine, who were 17 and 15, and who wrote to her every week in letters so long they required extra postage. She told him about the house in Wiltshire, which was cold in winter and beautiful in spring, and which she had run since her mother's death 6 years ago, because Sir Reginald considered domestic management beneath his attention. She told him that she had read every book in her father's library twice, including a treatise on animal husbandry that she suspected had been shelved there by mistake. Sebastian listened. He asked questions, not the questions one asks to demonstrate interest, but the questions one asks because the answers genuinely matter. He asked her about the Wiltshire tenants, and she told him about the Hardings, who had farmed the same plot for 3 generations, and the Mitchells, whose youngest daughter she had taught to read using her own books because the village school was 4 miles away and the child was lame. He asked her about her mother, and her face changed, not with grief exactly, but with the particular tightening of someone who has mourned so thoroughly that what remains is not sadness, but the permanent awareness of absence. She was not quiet, Beatrice said. She was the opposite of quiet. She filled every room she entered. When she died, the rooms stayed empty. My father could not bear the silence, so he left. Not physically, but in every way that mattered. And she stopped. She looked at her hands. I became the silence, because someone had to fill the space she left, and silence was the only thing that did not remind him of her. Sebastian set down his glass. He looked at this woman he had married that morning for a river and a drainage scheme. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like something breaking open inside his chest, that she had been carrying the weight of an entire household's grief on her shoulders since she was 17 years old, and she had done it so quietly that no one had noticed, including the father who should have noticed first. He discovered that she had opinions about land management that were more informed than half the men he sat with in the House of Lords, and that she disguised them as observations because she had learned that opinions coming from her were received as impertinence. By 10 o'clock, the candles had burned low, and the servants had cleared the table twice, and neither of them had noticed. Beatrice was telling him about a method of crop rotation she had read about in the agricultural reports her father discarded unread, and Sebastian was watching her face, animated now, unguarded, the careful stillness entirely gone, and thinking that he had almost missed this, that he had designed a marriage specifically to prevent this, that he had walked into a church that morning, intending to acquire a quiet wife and a river, and had instead, by the simple act of paying attention, discovered a woman he wanted to know for the rest of his life. "You should write to your sisters again," he said when they finally rose from the table. "And say what?" "That the Duke is a fool," he said, "but that he's learning." The spring passed, then the summer. Beatrice did not transform Aldworth House. She was not a woman who made grand gestures or dramatic changes. She did what she had always done. She paid attention. She learned the rhythms. She sat with Mrs. Thorne and with Mercer, the steward. And she listened. And she asked the questions that nobody else had thought to ask. And the household settled into a new order that was not louder or brighter, but deeper, more considered, more alive. Her sisters came to stay in June. Arabella and Catherine arrived with 4 trunks between them and the uncontainable energy of 2 girls discovering London for the first time. They were loud where Beatrice was quiet, extravagant where she was restrained, and they adored their elder sister with a ferocity that made Sebastian understand for the first time what Beatrice had sacrificed, not just comfort or ambition, but the full expression of herself, given up piece by piece over years of being told to take up less space. He heard Catherine say to Arabella in the garden, thinking they were alone, "She laughs here. Have you noticed? She actually laughs." Sebastian, walking the other side of the hedge on his way to the stables, stopped. He stood very still. He listened to his wife laughing with her sisters in the garden of the house that was now hers, and he thought about Diana's note. I trust the morning went smoothly, and how close he had come to folding that note into his pocket and walking to Curzon Street and continuing to live the life he had designed, the one where Beatrice sat at his right hand in silence, and the bread crusts accumulated on trays sent to rooms she inhabited but did not occupy. He went to the House of Lords that afternoon and sat through a debate on poor relief and voted with more clarity than he had felt in months. And when he came home, Beatrice was in the library with Mercer's drainage plans spread across the desk and a pencil in her hand, and she looked up and said, "I think the Eastern Channel should be widened by 3 feet. Mercer disagrees. Would you like to hear my argument?" He sat down. "Yes," he said, "I would." She was right about the channel. Mercer admitted it a month later, standing in the field watching the water flow exactly where she had said it would, with an expression that combined professional humility with genuine admiration. Their son was born the following winter. They named him George, after Beatrice's father, a gesture that Sebastian offered without being asked, and which Beatrice received with a silence that was, for the first time, not absence, but fullness, the quiet of a woman who has been given something she did not know how to request and does not yet have words to acknowledge. Sir Reginald came for the christening. He walked through Aldworth House and he looked at his daughter, his quiet, unremarkable eldest daughter, the one he had given away to settle a land dispute. And he saw what Sebastian saw every morning when he came down to breakfast and found her already at the table, already reading, already thinking, already present in a way that filled the room without disturbing it. "You have done well, Bee," Sir Reginald said, using the name only her family used, and his voice cracked on the second word. Beatrice poured him tea. She did not say what she might have said, that she had done well despite him, not because of him, that the silence he had cultivated in her had been a prison she had only recently learned to leave. She poured the tea, and she said, "The estate is thriving. The drainage scheme has improved the yield on the southern fields by 1/3. George has your eyes." Sir Reginald looked at his grandson. He drank his tea. He stayed for 3 days and left without saying anything more, but he wrote to her every month after that, which he had never done before, and his letters were longer each time, as though he too were learning, very late, that his eldest daughter had things to say and that they were worth reading. Lady Wentworth married a widowed viscount the following year and moved to Northumberland. Sebastian heard this from Pemberton, who told him over brandy at the club with the satisfied air of a man reporting the final settlement of a minor debt. Sebastian nodded and changed the subject. Diana belonged to a version of himself that he no longer recognized, the version that had walked into a church intending to acquire a quiet wife and a river, and had found instead that the quiet wife was the most extraordinary woman he had ever met, and that the river, in the end, was the least important thing he gained. On an evening in early autumn, 2 years after their wedding, Sebastian came home from the Lord's to find Beatrice in the small dining room. Not the formal one, the small one, where they had eaten that first evening when she had told him about her sisters and the crop rotation and the treatise on animal husbandry. The candles were lit. The table was set for two. George was asleep upstairs, and the house was quiet with the particular settled hum of a place that is being lived in well. She was standing at the window, watching the last of the daylight fade over the square. She turned when he came in, and her expression, open, warm, entirely unguarded, was so different from the face he had seen at the wedding breakfast that he stopped in the doorway and simply looked at her. "What is it?" she said. "You are speaking," he said. "I'm standing silently at a window." "No," he said. "I mean, you speak now, all the time, at dinner, at breakfast, to Mercer, to Mrs. Thorne, to Pemberton's wife, who is terrified of you, incidentally. You argue with me about drainage channels. You told Lord Grey his position on the Corn Laws was inadequately researched. You wrote a letter to the Agricultural Society that they published. You speak." She looked at him with those dark, steady eyes. "You noticed," she said. "I notice everything about you. I have done since the wedding breakfast, when I noticed that you did not speak, and it has been the most important thing I have ever noticed about anyone." She crossed the room. She took his hand, not the way she had taken it at the altar, with the careful contractual precision of a woman fulfilling an obligation, but the way she took it now, every evening, with the easy certainty of a woman who knew it would be there. "I was not silent because I had nothing to say," she said. "I was silent because no one had ever made it safe to say it. And now?" She smiled. The full, unguarded, undefended version of the smile that had first appeared as a flicker on the staircase beside his mother's portrait, the smile that Mrs. Thorne had witnessed blooming over months, like something planted in good soil, finally given light. "Now," she said, "I cannot seem to stop." The candles burned. The dinner waited. Outside, the London evening settled over Grosvenor Square, and inside the small dining room at Aldworth House, the Duke and the Duchess sat down together in a silence that was not empty but chosen, the comfortable, companionable quiet of two people who had learned over the course of a single extraordinary day and the 2 years that followed it, that the most important words are the ones you make it safe for someone else to say. If this story stayed with you, you might find the next one does too. They arrive here like a voice finally given room to speak whenever they are ready.